Hello, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the Business Revolution week so far. We're very excited to be bringing this special event to you, and we thank you for your attendance. My name is John Hannon, and I'm an analyst with Culkin Ginsberg. I wanted to run through a few housekeeping items before we jump into the informative roundtable that we've got for you. First, I want to thank our wonderful sponsors and subject matter experts for their continued support. Without them, none of this would be possible, so we're very thankful to them. Second, I'd like to give a disclaimer. The information that you're about to hear in this roundtable discussion is not intended as legal, financial, or advice of any kind, and it may not be used as such. Advice must be tailored to the specific circumstances of each case. Every effort has been made to ensure that this information is up to date as of the date of this roundtable. It is not intended to be a full and exhaustive explanation, nor may you use this information to replace the advice of your own legal counsel. The speakers assume no liability for any verbal mistakes or other errors contained in this roundtable, or for changes that occur in the future that affect anything that's discussed therein. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Mike, and we'll jump right into this informative roundtable. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Mike Ginsberg, President and CEO of Culkin Ginsberg. Very excited to be here today with Rui, Andy, and Chris. We're going to be discussing consumer bankruptcies and optimizing the bankruptcy process in this COVID era that we've been forced to live through the better part of the last 8 months. We're going to get into a lot of different discussions here about what's influencing bankruptcy rates, how recoveries have been impacted. We'll look forward at the election and beyond the election and what's been going on here, and other pertinent topics relevant to consumer bankruptcies. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Let me take a moment to introduce each of you, and then we'll get started. First, we have Rui Cardoso. Rui is co-founder and the CEO of Quantum 3 Group. Prior to joining and launching Q3G, as it's called, Quantum 3 Group, in 2010, he served as president and COO of Beeline for about 8 years and the vice president of risk at First Union Wells Fargo Bank prior to that. Rui is also an adjunct professor. Rui, I didn't know that. You and I have that in common. We'll discuss the merits and pitfalls of that later. For several years at the College of Business at Florida International University. Rui, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Mike.
Absolute pleasure. Next in line is Andy Carlson. Andy is managing director and head of Garnett's Charged Off and Bankruptcy Loan Sales Group in its Minneapolis office. Since joining Garnett in 2012, he has managed the sale of over 10 billion, wow, that's a big number, of loan portfolios and other transactions. Overall, Andy has presided over the execution of more than 35 billion in consumer loan sales, purchases, corporate capital type transactions. He also served as director of Jefferson Capital, going back prior to his involvement with Garnett. Andy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Mike.
Last but not least, Chris Lundquist. Chris is the business unit president of fraud and credit risk management at Verisk. Did I pronounce that right? Verisk?
Yeah. Verisk.
I thought I pronounced that right. Yeah. Financial. He came to Verisk as part of an acquisition of his own company, LCI, a number of years back. And prior to that acquisition, Chris served as Chief Executive Officer and Chief Strategy Officer for National Bankruptcy Services. Chris, thank you very much for joining us today.
Mike, pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let's start things off. Chris, maybe you can give us just kind of a high-level perspective, and then we'll talk with Rui and Andy about this as well. What are the big factors today impacting bankruptcy rates?
Sure, it's a great question. And if you are tracking in the industry, you'll know that bankruptcies have been declining since COVID-19. We're down about 40% since March, and we've actually seen, when you look at the different types of chapters, Chapter 13 in particular, where consumers stay on a bankruptcy plan for 5 years, those are down almost 60%. And it's really for a number of different reasons. We'll start with reduced collection activities. So if you think about things like foreclosure, the ability to be on forbearance, repossessions, lawsuits, even moratoriums around evictions, all of these are trigger factors that cause people to file bankruptcy. And those things under the COVID-19 environment have certainly been constrained. The other area is really around government stimulus. And we saw this early in COVID-19 where we had what I'll call enhanced unemployment benefits. We certainly have seen stimulus checks. All of these provided a buffer or a bridge for consumers that likely would have ended up in bankruptcy and instead had an option out. The other area that I think is interesting is really in COVID-19, we've seen reduced spending. And if you look at what triggers a consumer to file bankruptcy, it typically is built around some level of unemployment, or it's really about how much debt they have. And so we look at debt to income ratios. And we've actually seen lower spending during COVID-19, and we've actually seen consumers that are paying off some of their debt. So that's also a contributing factor. To a lesser extent, we're also seeing logistical challenges, whether it be within the district courts or the trustees or the attorneys, which has had a minor effect on bankruptcies as well. But those are some of the main drivers in what we believe are, from a short-term perspective, bringing bankruptcies down. And I can certainly talk about longer-term rates as we move into this webinar further.
Chris, thank you. Andy, Rui, are you seeing any additional factors that are kind of influencing consumer bankruptcies in today's market?
I'll add to that, but very little. I think Chris covered it very well, because what we're really seeing, I call it the great paradox, because you have unemployment going up and went up. All our prior experience was that whenever unemployment goes up, bankruptcies go up. And this time that really did not happen, which really threw a lot of people off in terms of forecasting. And really the reasons are the ones that Chris covered very well. So in essence, what we have is, I consider that we have some artificial factors here, external factors that are keeping people from filing bankruptcy or from having to file bankruptcy. And that also makes it very hard to do predictions around this, and we'll talk more about it. But it's really a unique combination of factors, and I think that it's somewhat unprecedented in our recent history. We haven't had an economic event or down cycle with these same characteristics. So it's a little bit, learning as you go, and what we've seen in the bankruptcy volumes going up is similar probably to the surprises that you've seen on the collections world, where back in March, everyone thought doomsday was coming, and doomsday didn't come. Actually, as Chris pointed out, there's more disposable income, and people actually start paying their debts, too much to the surprise and the happiness of many creditors.
I think they both covered it pretty well. The one thing that I was actually going to ask is, we've heard a lot of the same things, but one of the things that I've had a hard time correlating, and was wondering if you guys had any input on this, is, as Rui, you alluded to, that charge-off rates are going down, just generally speaking. And over time, as we've watched some of our clients' portfolios, usually the ratio of charge-offs and bankruptcies are, stick together pretty well. I was just wondering if you guys had any feedback about how, how those rates are sticking together. Are they separated? Like there's fewer bankruptcies now relative to total charge-offs, or is it really just kind of a function of overall charge-offs and that ratio is holding true? Do you guys have any color on that?
I'll tackle it from some of the research we've done in the past, which I think will drive the mix of the ratio of charge-off to bankruptcy. Ultimately, in our past studies, we have found that it's really about a trigger factor on which direction you end up going. Ultimately, you still end up with a consumer that is likely either overspent themselves into a financial problem or has had some sort of one-time event that may have triggered that. And so I do believe you've seen a short-term decrease in what you're seeing in bankruptcy, and it's driven because of the events like forbearance. Half of the people that file bankruptcy in a Chapter 13 are doing so to save the home. And with forbearance, with the inability to have foreclosures, that trigger factor that would drive them into bankruptcy doesn't exist today. And so when you start seeing that change in terms of what types of collection activities you can make, you're going to see that group of people that may be in a charge-off population shift back into bankruptcy as things move forward. So those are some of the observations we've seen, certainly looking at 20, 25 years worth of history around what drives people on the bankruptcy side. One other interesting thing I wanted to add to talk a little bit about employment. We've done a lot of work from an econometric perspective to understand the effects of unemployment and bankruptcy. And what we found is there's a lag effect of around 18 months. And we've also found that unemployment is less of a driver than employment is. We found that people file bankruptcy to protect their future income. So they're typically not filing right when they lose their job. It's really about when they get their next job, and then they're using it to protect that income going forward. So a couple interesting findings there as you start looking at the correlations and, what are the effects of COVID-19, and we start seeing and going out into 2021 and what that's going to mean.
Chris, let's use that as a kind of a jump in to talk about COVID-19. And then Rui, I want to come back to volumes as well, projections and drivers, but let's use this as an opportunity. Andy, why don't you get us started this time and say, these past 8 months have been nothing short of unprecedented, right? A lot of different ways, right? I'm a sports fan, and for 2-3 months, we weren't even watching sports. It was really hard. Now sports are being played without fans, which is really incredible. And that's just a small part of it. That's called entertainment. But how has COVID-19 impacted your business as it relates to consumer bankruptcies?
That's an interesting question. So, one of the things I think we should really look at is just pricing and how it's affected pricing. At first, when COVID-19 hit, there was a lot of concern that bankruptcies were going to be hit the same way. And so when we were monitoring transactions that were occurring prior to COVID and ones that were coming, that were happening right at the very beginning of COVID, there's a lot of concern in the market. Pricing was, down substantially. But that one, the bankruptcies seem to, just generally speaking, bounce back even more quickly than the charge-offs, whether that be, there's less elasticity in the bankruptcies. But there was a pretty quick bounce back, some of which, similar to charge-offs, I think was a function of there's just not a lot. I mean, we've talked about that. There's not nearly as many bankruptcies going around, and some people just have a lot of capital to deploy. But where we saw some really interesting changes was in the secured bankruptcies. So secured bankruptcies being secured primarily by an automobile that had a very different pricing factor than those that are unsecured. At first, the pricing for those changed dramatically because the expectation was a few different things. One, there was the various moratoria on repossessing vehicles, so that wasn't an option if somebody dismissed. Or I'm guessing that Rui will be able to talk quite a bit about this too. But two was that used car prices at that point in time were expected to plummet with the bankruptcy of Hertz and just an expected overwhelming population of used cars coming into the market. People were expecting pricing to go down, and what happened was that none of that happened. It actually went the other direction. If you'd have asked me 6 months ago, when's the best time to buy a used car, I would have said fall of 2020, hands down, no doubt. And if you look at what's happening right now, realization rates on, putting cars into the market are above where they were prior to COVID. We're looking at transactions where they're at 110, 120% of book value, and that's not what we ordinarily see. And so from a pricing perspective, we're seeing, a bounce back in both the unsecured and the secured space. Participation wise, it seems that the normal cast of characters are still continuing to participate in transactions. We haven't really seen any fade. And, from a creditor perspective, a lot of creditors are actually quite interested in moving on them. They just don't know how.
Yeah,
Andy, that was excellent. Thank you.
I just
Rui?
wanted to add to what Andy was saying on the secured bankruptcy and on that auto component. The interesting phenomenon that we saw of first the used cars prices going down. Some of the auctions were not running, and people were actually not going to the car lots to buy cars. So there was really no demand. And then all of a sudden that demand comes back. So used car sales go up. So the value of those secured bankruptcy portfolios do go up. And they go up significantly for another reason, because I believe there are slowdowns on production of new cars. And so the used car market is at its prime now. And we all watch TV, and you probably have noticed that this year we've seen a lot less commercials about next year's model than we normally start seeing back in July with launching new models and come to our dealership because we have new models. And there's not a lot of those. So there's the pandemic caused some slowdowns on production. So there's probably a lot less inventory of new cars. So the used car market goes up, and it increases the value or benefits the value of a secured bankruptcy.
Thank you, Rui. Thank you. And Chris, anything you want to add as it relates to COVID-19, how things have changed? You could even speak about work from home if that's something that you want to talk about. It's just been very, very treacherous waters over the past 6 to 8 months. And how are you seeing the world?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of places I can go with that question. I'll certainly stay within the realm of bankruptcy. And in terms of, we've seen the same thing when it comes to secured and, those factors driving car prices actually up in the used market. Really what we're seeing overall is, the work from home has had an impact with access to courts. And we've actually seen it slow down certain types of other types of court activities. Some of the underlying factors, and we'll probably talk more about recoveries as we go further, but things like dismissal rates drop down, which is impacted not only by access to be able to go to the courts, but how the trustees are thinking about bankruptcies. And some of the trustee offices, we started to see some minor slowdowns in payments, but really not very affected from their ability to switch to work from home and being able to pay out Chapter 13 plans and things like that. So my overall assessment of the work from home side and really the closure of the courts is a very minor impact from COVID-19. We haven't seen a lot from that perspective, which I think is good. And I think the resiliency I can talk about from a personal business perspective, our ability to deliver our solutions have largely been unimpacted. And we've seen many in the industry in the same ways. I think if you start getting into other types of ancillary businesses right next to bankruptcy, like collections and things like that, you probably have much more of an impact if you're not able to actually be in the office and do collection calls and things of that nature. But that's what I'd add. So.
Thank you. Yeah, it's hopefully this will pass. Hopefully soon we get back to some normalcy. Rui, can you share with us from a volumes perspective? Let's look at both 20 and going forward into 21, and if you have line of sight into beyond that as well. Projections, drivers, how are you seeing that?
Sure, and Chris already opened the discussion on that, where he shared with all of us, the bankruptcy volumes trend going significantly down on any given week. Currently, bankruptcy volumes are 40 to 45% lower than they were in the comparable week of last year, and that's the reality. So when you want to try to look into the future, I'll start by saying that I believe that it's very hard to predict, because this pandemic has thrown a lot of curveballs to everyone. So I think it's quite hard to predict, mainly because of two reasons. The first one is, as we've mentioned, there's really no recent experience in terms of a macroeconomic situation that has the same characteristics from where we could draw some experience and put it into projections here. This is the brave new world. The other reason, Mike, is that the situation is actually still fluid. So there are still things happening and things that will happen that we don't know how they will happen, that will have an impact on that bankruptcy volume. Compared to the last crisis back in 2008, 2010, after an initial period, we knew what was going to happen. So it was in a way, it was easier to predict. So, but right now here, when I say fluid, I say things like moratorium on rent payments, on mortgages, extended unemployment benefits. Will there be more stimulus checks? When will the travel and hospitality industry be fully operational? Will a new administration have more economic or social measures, both on the business and the personal? Will student loans be dischargeable in bankruptcy? So there's a lot of factors that are still fluid that will have an impact, and so it is hard to predict. But I'll get there. Not avoiding your question. Another thing that comes to mind is that in terms of unemployment, I don't think that we've done, unfortunately, because what we're seeing is that there's a lot of large corporations that were being subsidized, whether through PPP loan assistance or some others, where those subsidies are coming to an end, and those companies are now forced to right-size. American Airlines, Disney, tens of thousands of people that are going to be laid off and could cause a new wave of unemployment, and depending on the circumstances, could have a significant impact on the bankruptcies. I will say, though, that, and I think that we can agree, but I'll very interested on the other's opinion, but I think there's a certain consensus that we will see a rise in bankruptcies. And the simple reason is that the full economic recovery will not be fast enough to absorb the entire volume of unemployment. Depending on your political beliefs, you can argue that the recovery will be slower or faster, but I think everyone agrees that it's not going to be overnight. So my prediction is that bankruptcy volumes will go up. I think that we're going to finish 2020 at around, say, 550,000 consumer bankruptcy filings, which is down from about 750,000, give or take, approximately last year because of this decrease that we have experienced. Nevertheless, later 2020 and into 2021, I believe that we're going to see a rise, and it could be significant. The first quarter, we may be volumes similar to the first quarter that we had on 2020. And I think that the remainder of the year, Q2 through Q4, we could see an increase as high as 40% or more from 2020. Obviously, the volume of this increase and the timing of this increase is going to depend a lot on the factors that I mentioned earlier, which are outside of our control, and for which there's not really a well-defined plan of when will things expire, when will new measures be implemented, if any. So I think that overall, with what we know today, my prediction would be that 2021 would be 30 to 35% higher than 2020, and depending on the scenario, could be actually a lot higher. That's my prediction, Mike.
Rui, thank you. Andy, Chris, are you seeing the world the same way or differently?
Andy, I'll let you go first and then I can jump in.
I was actually just going to say that sounds like everything that I've heard from others. So, but I was going to ask a question. So I'll let you, Chris, go and follow with the question.
Sure. Rui, I agree with everything you said there, and those are really the unknowns. And so we put these into buckets of the factors that affect the timing. I think we all have seen that given we are in an election year, and you have both parts of the government, either the Democrats or the Republicans, that would not want to see an economic demise during that moment, that you're going to continue to see some level of government stimulus. Even though we haven't seen that package kind of get through the House, certainly the idea is to at least transition into next year. So when you think about those short-term factors that are affecting higher bankruptcy rates, or those trigger factors for people to file, they're being suppressed. The forbearances, the evictions, the things of that nature. It's all about timing. When will those go away? Is it going to be the first quarter? Is it going to be the second quarter? Are we going to see the rise starting in January? You know, one of the things that we're trying to get our arms around a little better right now is the impact of those consumers that would have filed and how they are going to work their way through the system when those types of changes occur. And so call it that pent-up demand for bankruptcy, we see and expect to see in the system next year as well. Our current forecast for this year is not too far off where you guessed. It's approximately 525,000. And as we move into next year, we have a range of 850 to 1 million. And that's really built around timing. And it's really those factors of consumers that would have filed this year and when they come into the system next year. And then obviously the pent-up demand that we see from the overall increases in unemployment and things of that as they go into the system. But we're currently forecasting growth to start happening in about March, and then take it out through the year. But we have built U-shaped models, W-shaped models, L-shaped models, and you probably have heard all those terms. A year ago, I would have never heard that type of language. Now, welcome to COVID-19, we're familiar with that. And then, you know, what's going to happen in COVID-19 over the holidays, and if we see significant upticks in infection rates and things of that nature, you may see government stimulus that really extends out further next year. So I think that's all the major things. So Rui, a lot of exactly what you said.
Andy, you have a question?
Yeah, so you know, this was just kind of a theoretical question about the call it borrower quality going in. So if right now volumes are down in bankruptcy, and you know, I would have expected with them to be down that those would have possibly been like your more adversely selected borrower, so to speak, but dismissal rates have also dropped. And so I was just kind of wondering how you guys, you know, see all of those factors that you talked about, you know, the trailing factors of it's 18 months after unemployment, and, you know, when the spike of consumers come back from all that pent-up demand, are those going to be the better consumers that are going to continue to keep dismissal rates lower, or are they going to be the ones that somehow, some way were able to just get through the process and now they've just hit bottom, and those are going to be the ones that are more likely to flame out of bankruptcy? And I'm just curious because, like everything else we've been talking about, I would have expected dismissal rates to creep up if they were lower quality consumers now. You guys have any color on that?
Rudy, you want to go first? I'm happy to jump in too.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I'll give you a sort of a 50,000 foot level and tell you something that may impress you, and there are some nuances to it. But really, Andy, the reasons that people force people into bankruptcy do not really change over time, and I think that's the reason why we are not seeing some of the bankruptcies. It's because if those reasons were there, people would file bankruptcy. And so in the future, I think people will go into bankruptcy for the same reasons as before. The other thing that we have experienced from our own portfolios is that even on down cycles, there is not a very significant change in terms of the quality of the Chapter 13, and I believe that you're focusing on Chapter 13, which is what you deal the most with. Even in economic down cycles, there is not a very dramatic change in the quality of the Chapter 13 consumer, because at the end of the day, in order to qualify for a Chapter 13, you have to meet a certain number of requirements. So it's almost like an underwriting process for someone to qualify for a Chapter 13. And unless those change significantly, then the quality of the Chapter 13 individual doesn't change. Now, there could be changes caused by other factors. You know, any given creditor decides to change their risk profile, and that will certainly also will have an impact on those that filed Chapter 13. But if you want to compare apples to apples, I don't expect to see a major change in terms of the Chapter 13 profile of Bank A and Chapter 13 profile of Bank A in the near future. Chris?
Yeah, Rui, I agree with you. And in fact, our tracking of payments and dismissal rates and conversions and the various types of things that go into a bankrupt consumer, and certainly looking over 20 years of history, the delta between that consumer has been very small. It's a very predictable recovery path in terms of a Chapter 13 and recovery levels. Some of the things that we're tracking right now that could be factors, and you brought up dismissal rates, and they were way down initially, and we've actually seen them get back to similar rates of where they were before. So we can chalk that off to a couple different things, and one of them we do think is government stimulus. So that's probably kept some people on a plan. You also have to think about the dynamic of the bankruptcy itself, where you have trustees that get paid by consumers on a plan. And so you've seen them to be more willing to try and work with debtors to keep them in a Chapter 13. So we believe that that's also impacted our lower dismissal rates. But we actually are watching a lot of things. We've looked at orders approving modified plans. We've looked at motions to modify plans. We've looked at reaffirmation agreement levels, loan modifications, hardship discharges, all of these things that we might have expected to see changes. We really haven't. What we have seen is increases in orders suspending or forgiving plan payments. They've about tripled, as well as orders granting payment moratoriums. And so those are going to keep people in a plan longer. And then, you know, the question is there a pent-up dismissal increase coming as well? And we're starting to see the dismissal rates, as I said, go back up to some of those previous levels. But again, I'll go back to kind of where Rory started, that over the past, I'll say 20 years since we tracked bankruptcies, the deltas in Chapter 13 behavior, recoveries, and overall performance has been fairly steady. And we've gone through many economic cycles, including, you know, the Great Recession and mortgage foreclosure crisis, 2008 and 9. And we really didn't see that move the needle here. So.
Now, go ahead.
Just quickly to add to what Chris put very well, Andy, what we have seen over the last 2 decades is that you may have a significant change in the ratio between Chapter 7s and Chapter 13s. So as unemployment goes up, typically a leading indicator of bankruptcies to come, it's usually unemployment goes up, default rates go up, bankruptcy volumes go up. I mean, here it may be a lot quicker if all of a sudden there is no more rent moratorium and evictions come into place and foreclosures take off. That will happen very quickly, the increase in volumes. But as the unemployment goes up, you have less people that qualify for a Chapter 13, because as you know, you have to be a wage earner to qualify for a reorganization. So you see a shift in terms of the ratio of Chapter 7s to Chapter 13s. Chapter 7s are traditionally always more than Chapter 13s, anywhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of everything that is filed. But you can see a shift to even more. And we saw that. I'm sure that probably Chris also saw that in 08, 09, where that shift was very, very significant in terms of many more Chapter 7s as compared to 13s.
Yeah, I think Rui, that's a great call out. I have one other thing to add, but Mike, go ahead first.
No, Chris, please.
So I think the one X factor to all of this, and Rui, you mentioned it earlier, and it shouldn't be overlooked, is student loans. Right now, today, the way the law is written, student loans are not dischargeable in bankruptcy. So you have a flavor of an individual that goes into a Chapter 13 or a Chapter 7, as you said, that has a profile of behavior that has been very much the same for a long time. If we do see a change, and this could likely happen with a democratic change in our government to enable the discharge of student loans within bankruptcy, we may see a change in the consumers that go into a Chapter 13 or even a 7 as well. And so I think that will be something we'll want to look at and certainly explore more as things move forward. But that may be the one X factor to the whole thing.
So correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen. Rui, you and your company, you purchase and you service consumer bankruptcies. Andy, you and your company, through a competitive process, sell bankruptcies. And Chris, your company predominantly services and provides services and consulting around bankruptcy. First of all, is that correct? Am I summarizing how you approach the marketplace? Did I miss a service offering? Did I botch that?
I can just add on the LCI side, a lot of what we do in for Verisk under LCI, which is our brand or the company that was acquired, we're selling technology solutions that enable companies, typically direct financial companies or medical or utilities or telecom, anyone who has a debt, to manage their bankruptcies. So we provide the data, the analytics, and the workflow tools to be able to service a bankruptcy in-house.
So now you're speaking to your client base, okay, and your prospective new clients who are thinking about this particular market segment. Rui, I'm going to start with you. Talk about your strategies currently, what they should be thinking about as it relates to strategies for effectively handling bankruptcies in today's market.
Sure, Mike. I think one of the things that this pandemic has shown us, it has shown us a lot of things, some of them we never wanted to know about, but one of the things that this pandemic shown us is that bankruptcy volumes can change significantly and very quickly.
And without real pre-knowledge, right? I mean,
right. I mean, in a matter of weeks, we went from volumes similar to 2019 to volumes that are almost half of 2019. That's very dramatic. So from a creditor standpoint, this causes serious challenges. On one end, in terms of predicting losses, and this discussion that we are having here in terms of trying to provide some color in terms of the forecast in the future, it's important for help creditors predict the losses. But the other one is really also capacity planning for the resources to handle the bankruptcy processes. What I mean by that is, if a creditor is handling their bankruptcy process entirely in-house, and if they have the same team today that they had a year ago, one can argue that you have a team that it's twice the size that you need. Conversely, if you right size, and when the bankruptcy volumes go up, it's when the bankruptcy volumes go up, they can go up very quickly, and it creates again a tremendous challenge in terms of capacity planning, in hiring and training of those in-house resources to absorb this increased bankruptcy volume. To compound the problem, the bankruptcy recovery process, which is administrative in nature, has very tight deadlines. So there are certain things that need to be done by a certain time to ensure that you're going to have the recovery. So there's really not a lot of time to plan, to make plans to hire people and then hire and then train. I mean, it's a real challenge. And that's really one of the reasons why outsourcing is something that makes so much sense in this arena. It's not that it can't be done in-house, but there are really reasons that call for outsourcing. And I'm using outsourcing in the broad sense of the word, whether it's third-party servicing or asset sale or a combination of those. So, you know, like I said, these functions can, and I think my colleagues would agree that all these functions that are provided by outsourcing companies can be done in-house. I mean, they can be done in-house. The question is how cost-effective it is, because a lot of these are very cumbersome tasks and very resource-intensive, where the solution is really to develop automation. But to develop automation, the costs are high, and it is usually not cost-effective for one single entity, one single creditor, to spend the money on R&D to develop that automation. Conversely, companies that provide BK solutions, like the ones on this panel, have invested heavily in creating those efficient processes, because they can really amortize it over a large client base, and that translates, those efficient processes translate in significant net savings to the client. So that's some of the reasons why outsourcing makes sense. I would also mention that when you have someone that does this for a living, in that it's an expert, they usually do a good job, probably better than what you can do if that is one of the 20 functions that you do in-house. So if I were to leave all of our viewers with a message today, I would focus on 2 points. Number one, you should have a robust process to identify and monetize your bankruptcies. And number two is, when you're evaluating the options on how to accomplish that, I would encourage you to include outsourcing in the broad sense of the word, to include outsourcing as one of the options that you should be compared. I think that you'll be pleasantly surprised with what you're going to be finding out.
Rui, that was excellent. Thank you. Andy, let's change gears and talk about debt sales as it relates to bankruptcies. Maybe you could start with the creditor's point of view, and if you have anything to add from the buyer's perspective.
Thanks, Mike. I was actually going to parrot a lot of what Rui said about just outsourcing, broadly speaking. Speaking from the creditor's perspective, even he talked about expertise. From a creditor's perspective, their job is to extend the loans and to be really good at that. That's where they make their money. They're not making their money in collecting the charge-offs or collecting the bankruptcies. They should be focused on what they're focusing on. They're measured by different metrics. They have efficiency ratios that are important to them. Bankruptcies have cost attached to them, and the costs and the revenues and the recoveries aren't always matched together. So you can have mismatches. Efficiency, he talked about all of those things. Those things really are things that we have a lot of conversations about with creditors as well. But one thing that I want to emphasize that I don't think we've really touched on is really the safety of outsourcing bankruptcies versus even other charge-off types. And I'm not saying that other charge-off types are more dangerous, but bankruptcies, as I'm sure Rui or Chris can attest to, have a lot of insulation around them from an outsourcing perspective. If you look at the CFPB's complaints and where they're being generated from in the consumer collection space, most of the themes that they touch on are eliminated in the bankruptcy process. You don't have people that are saying that debt's not mine because they've scheduled it. You don't have outbound collection calls and people, making calls at 9:30 at night or allegations of harassment because they're not calling. They're providing a very high-tech, high-touch, efficient administrative process that's very safe. And so when we talk about outsourcing, broadly speaking, for those, and this is a lot of time is a jumping point with creditors that we talk to, is start with your bankruptcies, whether it be from an outsourcing, again, third-party servicing or selling perspective, because if you're afraid of the process or you're afraid of what could go wrong, there's a lot of insulation by using bankruptcy providers. So that's a jumping point with a lot of the creditors that we work with. Another interesting thing from a creditor perspective that we find is just the way that they write down accounts that are bankruptcy. I'm going to, again, pick on auto just because we touched on that earlier. A lot of creditors will write down their cars to the book value. And so if they're looking for some type of incremental gain, if they wrote down a car to 50 cents on the dollar, and again, I'm just using broad numbers here, yet they can sell it for 60 cents on the dollar, they now have a recovery, where in certain other products they may not have. So even if they haven't charged them off yet because of their charge-off process, there's still the opportunity to have a recovery in an account that's not technically charged off. And so there's a lot of unique approaches in BK that and not a lot of unique accounting tools that creditors can utilize that they just can't in other traditional charge-offs. And so that's one of the reasons why I take a particular interest in bankruptcies and why we do move a lot of bankruptcies.
Andy, thank you. That was very informative. Chris, do you want to wrap up this particular topic?
Sure, I'll add just a couple things. As a servicer as well, one of the things that I remember the most in talking to some of our creditor clients is really around where they want to focus. And I remember a secured servicer, and we were talking to them about the outsourcing option. And they said, Chris, our job is to sell cars and underwrite cars. It's not to manage bankruptcies. So as an organization, we want to focus on where we can be really good. And that's why we look for companies like yours that can actually do that outsourcing. And I think, Rui, you touched on that a lot when you were talking about that subject matter expertise, the leverage and scale of the technology and the processes, and really the idea around outsourcing. It also gives you, to reiterate, Rui, one of the things you said, it allows you to manage that capacity planning, which is going to be a challenge right now during COVID-19. They're too low, their bankruptcies are low, they're going to go up. You're going to have to scale if you're a servicer or a creditor to be able to handle that increased volume. And that's where these options of selling your bankruptcy or servicing them make a lot more sense.
Wow, Chris, that was great. Thank you. Three of you, I think, really summed things up quite well from your perspectives. I'm going to ask you to go around. Chris, I'm going to start with you. I'm a sports enthusiast, as I told you earlier. Parting shot. One last thing that you want the audience to understand, and it could be about your business, but it could also be about the industry. However you want to end things, the microphone is yours.
Well, thank you. Well, certainly I shared a little bit of what I would have kind of wrapped up with just a minute ago, but I think it's important really to understand we have an impending growth in BK coming next year. And if you are a creditor or if you are in the ARM industry and you have to manage accounts that are going to go bankrupt, start planning ahead. What you don't want to do is find out that the demand has gone up and you're not in a position where you can manage those. So my recommendation, plan ahead for this. It's coming and it's just around the corner.
Chris, thank you. Andy, you're up.
Sure. I'm going to echo Chris in one way, which is plan ahead. as we're seeing right now from a pricing perspective, prices are up, demand is up. Now would be the time to really start thinking about what you're going to do from whether it be a servicing strategy or whether it be a sales strategy. Right now, there's clearly capacity in both places. There is pent up demand for purchasing accounts, and there's servicing capacity. So you get ahead of it now before the wave does hit.
Andy, well done. Rui, parting shot.
Thank you, Mike. Chris and Andy teed it up perfectly. And so I'm just going to go in the same wave and point out the following. On one end, we're saying that you need to plan ahead, get ready, do what you need to do now. But at the same time, we are telling them that we really don't know when the bankruptcies are going to go up and by how much are going to go up. So how can we combine these two seemingly different factors? Well, the solution is look for outsourcing, make it their problem, because you can outsource 10 accounts or you can outsource 10,000 accounts. It all of a sudden becomes other people's problem. So you can plan now, and if it's in an outsourcing solution, come hell or high water, you are ready. So that's my message here.
Wow. And I think you wrapped it up really, really well. I'll say this, shameless plug here for all three of you. They should not be doing this themselves. Listen, anybody who's trying to predict the outcome of a sporting event or the fluctuations in the stock market have been proven at best ineffective over the years, right? When to get in, when to get out, what to bet, those types of things. Why flirt with disaster? When it comes to bankruptcies, one thing we've learned today is expect the unexpected. Change in the marketplace is what we should anticipate. What I would suggest is well in advance, get in touch with these people, all three of them. Understand your options, make an informed decision, engage with an expert, and then you're ready. Then you're ready. It's their headache, as Rui said, but it's your headache and it's coming. There's no question about it. The tsunami is out there. The question isn't if, it's when and how hard is it going to hit. And then the recovery afterwards and how you're going to deal with that, how the economy is going to deal with that. And let's face it, it's even more toxic because we're going through an election, which means change and uncertainty. And those things influence this as well. Here's my parting shot. There's two. One is I learned something interesting from Rui today. I wrote it down. Capacity planning. Capacity planning. I love it. Capacity planning. Here's the issue, folks. I don't care what business you're in. We all have to run a profitable P&L. We're not in the business. We're not in a charitable business. We're in a business where we're trying to stay in business, manage a business efficiently, and frankly speaking, make a buck or two. Okay? That's why we assume these risks, because we want the rewards associated with it. Capacity planning, huge part of it, right? Look at your own infrastructure. Look at your own capabilities. Know what you're good at. Understand you're not necessarily good at this because you don't do it for a living. You don't eat, sleep, drink, and poop this stuff. You got to live this stuff in order to understand this stuff, in order to be able to react to this stuff, in order to be able to service consumer bankruptcies properly. Whether you're buying, outsourcing, doing both, it doesn't really matter. Be armed, be ready. Capacity planning, boy, I think that's wonderful. The second thing is I want to take a moment while everybody's still listening to thank these three gentlemen. They took time out of their busy schedules. They shared and imparted wisdom that I wasn't even anticipating, and I knew what we were going to be discussing. Okay? Very transparent, very professional. I hold all three of these gentlemen and their organizations in very high regard. Personally, I hand-selected each of them. Professionally, I know what they do for a living, and I know how good they are. Are there others in the marketplace? Certainly, but they're not here today. These three are. So we're going to exploit them and say, reach out, okay? But I want to thank you, the three of you, for your time and willingness. I think all of you are rock stars today. And I think you did a great job. So greatly, greatly appreciate it. I will also say thank you to Kelsey and John for making sure everything runs smoothly. If you leave that up to me, I'm just going to screw it up. So thank you, guys. Thank you all for your time and your patience today. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike. Rui, Andy, a pleasure to work with you on this.
Likewise. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Hello again. That was a wonderful roundtable, wasn't it? I learned a lot from our wonderful speakers, and I'm sure you did too. Before we finish, I want to quickly go over Q&A. If you asked a question in chat and hasn't been answered already, don't worry, you'll receive a response within 24 hours through email or another similar channel from one of our SMEs. In addition, I highly encourage you to connect with our speakers through the platform. They're extremely knowledgeable and they're super excited to share their knowledge with you. So I definitely encourage that. And feel free to reach out to us too, and to Mike, because I'm sure he'd love to talk with you as well. So once again, thank you for attending the Business Revolution Week, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.